My mother was a journalist who anchored the news in Cleveland, Ohio. This was her childhood dream after she watched a journalist named Beverly Burke deliver the news. She was amazed by her poise and delivery on the screen. My mom went on to study journalism at Johnson C. Smith University, and after some hard work, she finally made her dream come true. In fact, my mother won 2 Emmy Awards for her outstanding work. Back in 2006, she finally stepped away from the business to take care of my brother and I, but she made sure that we grew up familiar in the world that she once worked in. So when I'd get home from school, I'd watch shows on PBS Kids. And in the evening, I'd watch PBS NewsHour and other news outlets. I can remember sitting at the dinner table as a family, hearing the voices of Cleveland anchors like Leon Bibb come from the other room. One of the most memorable stories I remember was the story of Tamir Rice, a story that reached national news. A 12-year-old boy was playing at a local Cleveland park with a toy airsoft gun. Within 2 seconds of the police arriving, he was shot and killed. A 12-year-old boy murdered in broad daylight after officers failed to provide first aid assistance. I remember the night I watched the story on the news, recognizing the local reporters covering the story. And right behind my television, I could see my quiet and peaceful neighborhood. I grew up in Twinsburg, Ohio, an ordinary but safe town. It's most known for its annual Twins Days festival, the world's largest gathering of twins. You see, covering tragedies in a major city takes a toll on you. And because of that, my parents made sure we lived away from the headlines in Cleveland. We were only 20 minutes away from the city, but it felt like a world apart from the chaos my mother reported on. That was until the summer of 2015. I was playing at the local park behind my town's middle school. My brother and I, we were fascinated with the rocks at the time. And one day, I found a cool-shaped rock on the edge of a hill that I've never seen before. I thought I hit the jackpot. So I told my brother, Aaron, look at this rock I found. And then, a kid I've never seen before came from behind me and said, "Who gives a shit?" He pushed me off the edge. I only fell a couple of feet, but it could have been a nasty injury if I fell any deeper. My brother then confronted the kid until he ran away, and then he consoled me while I burst into tears. I quickly dusted off my shorts and found my mom standing by the park pavilion to tell her what happened. She drove us home quickly that day, leaving our rocks behind. Later that evening, my parents sat my brother and I down at the dinner table, and as we ate, we had the talk that all parents of color have at one point with their children. I remember glancing over at my brother, who looked like he'd heard this conversation years before me, and then my dad, who started off the conversation. He looked at me and said, "No matter what you do, people will always treat you differently based on what you look like. Don't let anyone stop you from being your true self." Now, let me add some context. Do I believe that Twinsburg, Ohio is a racist town? I don't. In fact, some of my fondest memories come from that exact park. And was that kid probably just jealous of my rock? Yeah. But I remember that day I had an epiphany that changed the way I viewed everything around me, including the news. I didn't know that racism existed. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but let me explain what I mean. I was always familiar with the term racism, but I never understood what it meant on a personal level. I was only 8 years old, 4 years younger than Tamir was. It never even occurred to me that I could have played with Tamir on the playground, or that could have been my own brother. It wasn't until later, though, at the Cronkite School, that I started to learn about the fairness doctrine. And as a journalism nerd, I was fascinated. So let me break it down too. In 1949, the FCC established a policy to prevent one-sided viewpoints on controversial issues. Now, I know that sounds great, right? But this is really hard to do. What exactly is fair coverage? How do you make sure you're presenting both sides fairly without silencing some perspectives? It turns out it was too hard, so it was repealed in 1987. And without a replacement, context was lost. Biased portrayals of people of color could dominate the news without context of their environment. Terms like fake news and misinformation became more common. And when the news finally does pay attention, it focuses on the most extreme cases, like the murder of Tamir Rice, while avoiding the conversations about the subtle daily forms of discrimination, because those aren't flashy enough. In that 10:30 a.m. class, it felt like my whole worldview came crashing down, because I couldn't believe how this one policy change shaped all the news I grew up watching. By that point, I was already familiar with the basic journalism skills, but that day told me that I still didn't understand the full responsibility of being a journalist. I thought back to when I entered my first ever newsroom at Cleveland.com. I was a freelance writer right back in the city my mom worked in. And in that newsroom, I met the anchor I grew up watching, Leon Bibb. At 81 years old, he's the first ever Black news anchor in Ohio. So you could imagine my reaction when they asked 17-year-old me to film an interview he was doing. When I tell you, I locked in on those camera angles. And after the interview, I told him I would be attending the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism to be an anchor, just like you. He looked at me and said, "That's a great school to be at." And then he told me a story about his time in college. One day in class, his professor asked students to choose someone to write a broadcast script for a story. Leon didn't volunteer at first, given the context of the early 60s. But then one student stepped up and said, "Leon, everyone knows you're the best writer in the class." He was the only Black person in that class, and he described it as the first time he ever saw his value as a journalist. As Leon began to tear up in front of me, he told me that I see myself in you. And despite the state of the world right now, you have the power to change it with storytelling. But when we see injustice as human beings, what's the role of a journalist? When journalists across the country like Don Lemon and Georgia Fort are being arrested, is it a journalist's duty to merely observe and report injustice, or challenge it? Well, as my dad would say, don't let anyone stop you from being your true self. And because of that, I refuse to allow false narratives to define the lives of the people I advocate for. And that's why I became a journalist. I'm only 19, but I already know that life doesn't follow a news script, and it never waits for you to be ready. So I'm going to be ready to be curious, restless, and eager to ask the right questions. Something I encourage us all to do. Think of it as being your own journalist. Today, I freelance for the Arizona Informant, Arizona's longest running Black newspaper. But I understand that journalism isn't just storytelling. It's access and power. Journalists get the power to speak for and about us, especially for those who can't speak for themselves. Or in Tamir Rice's case, those who never got the chance to. While Tamir isn't here to tell us his story, his memory is my guiding reminder of the responsibility I hold as a journalist, as a storyteller. The stories journalists tell are important because at their best, they help us understand the unfamiliar. We can shine a light on what's been overlooked, or take the liberty to ask better questions of each other, to think for ourselves. They nudge us, and we do the work. This is our job as humans. So after this, let's tell each other and listen to some stories for those who no longer can.